Hey class. So today in this lecture, we're going to be covering a concept that I've alluded to several times. I've mentioned the word before, and that is families. What is a Revit family? You've used them already, and you maybe didn't know it. And so let's dive in so that we can start to understand how to make our models better and start controlling them and making them look the way we want them to look. But in order to do that, you need to know about families. So the first question is, what is a family exactly? So if we're looking at this Revit model and you ask yourself what part of this model is a family, it's literally everything. The walls are a family, the columns are a family, the doors, the windows, the address, the trim around the house is a family, the ground is a family, the stair is a family, really everything. So everything that you see in 3D in Revit is probably a family. Family. The other thing that we haven't covered yet are annotations. And these are 2D objects that don't exist in 3D, but exist in views to help describe the elements of the view, like what you're seeing here. Those are also families. Dimensions are a family. This slope annotation is a family. There's what's called a filled region down at the bottom to show kind of the current grade around the house. That's also a family. Even the levels, the level tags that we've been using, those are a family. So now that you know what a family is, let's talk more about the types of families. There are 3 types of families in Revit. There's what's called a system family. There's a component family, or sometimes they call these loadable families. I've seen it both ways. You should probably know it as both component family or loadable family. And then what's called an in-place family. So let's dive into what each one, what that means. So a system family, let's just pull up all the bullet points here. The first thing you want to know about system families is there's stuff like walls, floors, roofs, ceilings. They're basic building elements that aren't as customizable as you'll see the loadable families are, or the component families. These families are, when you want to change something about them, you're limited to what you can change. You can't really change the functionality of these types of families. They are what they are. You can adjust the attributes. So for example, a wall is a system family. You can change the surface texture, the materials, you can add layers, you can change the thickness, but you can't really change how the wall behaves overall. It's just programmed into Revit. The other thing that's different about a system family compared to the others is where you edit this family. So system families are always edited inside of the Revit project environment is what they call it. It's where you're used to working in Revit. So up to this point, you've only worked in the Revit project environment. So when you open Revit and you open your project, that's the Revit project environment. That is where you would edit a system family. So during the exercise in this module, we'll get into how you edit it. That's not the point right now. I just want you to know that's one of the things that make a system family is where you edit it. Okay, so the next type of family is called a loadable family or a component family. Like I said, you know it by both names. And a component family is stuff that the first thing about it is you can control almost everything about a component family. Its shape, its size, how many attributes you can change, how it behaves. Almost everything is controllable with a component family. It gives you a lot more power. But in order to edit or create a loadable family, you have to edit it or create it in something that's called the Revit Family Editor environment. And we'll briefly touch on this throughout the course. I may teach you how to edit 1 or 2 families. For instance, a title block is a loadable family, so that might be something we're definitely going to edit. So that editing takes place in another area of Revit. And it looks almost exactly like the project environment. You just have different commands up in the ribbon that allow you to create different parts of a family. And then you take that family from the family editor and you load it into your project. And once it's in your project, you have limited ability to edit the family. And depending on how good you are at making families, you may be able to edit more things or change certain attributes about this family from the project environment. I'll show you examples. It's kind of confusing in concept, but once we get into the exercise, it'll start to make more sense. But just know that these are created outside of the project, and then inside they are loaded into the project. And then from that point on, you can still change attributes, but those attributes may be limited depending on whoever created the family. Okay, I already gave you examples. These are things like windows, doors. Those are the two that you've used already. Oh, and a title block. So you've already used 3 examples of a component family or a loadable family. But furniture, light fixtures, appliances, all of those types of things that aren't basic building elements, those are probably going to be a loadable family. Okay, so let's move on to the third type. Oh, sorry, just a note here. When people say Revit family, most of the time what they mean is a component family or a loadable family. So if you're searching the internet for a Revit family of some sort, like a pool table, you don't have to say it's a component or loadable family. The fact that you're searching for it outside of the project makes it very likely that you're looking for a component family. So that's what most people mean when they just call out a Revit family. All right, the third type is kind of a blending of the first and second type, and it's called an in-place family. So it has all the same attributes as a loadable family or a component family, with the exception of the fact that instead of creating it in the family editor, you can create it in the project environment. So that's why they call it in place. You're going to create a new family inside the project in the context of your project. So these are very specific families. Like it's stuff that you want to create only once for this one very specific instance in this project that you're working on. So if I'm working in a house and I have a really weird shaped countertop I want to create, I'm going to probably do it as an in-place family, because it might be hard to find a family that I load in and that will fit to maybe I have a round wall and I need a rounded countertop that follows that curve. It's going to be hard to find a countertop family that's going to fit in that spot. So in that case, I would probably do an in-place family. And what it does, when you make an in-place family, it converts the project environment briefly for a brief amount of time. It'll convert it into the Revit family editor, and it'll allow you to create a family from scratch inside your project. And we don't use these that often. Again, it's only for specific cases. And if you use too many of these in a project, it can start to slow your project down, and it is not good for your file health. So this is a less commonly used family type. Okay. Another thing you might need to know about families is we often talk about parameters and if a family is parametric or static. So we're going to find when I go through the exercise and we look for families, not all families, and when I'm talking about families right now, I'm talking about loadable or component families. So not system families and not in-place families. We're talking about the second type of family I told you about. They are either parametric or they're static. So if they're static, it means you can't really change anything about it. When you load it into your project, it is what it is. You can't change anything. Or maybe you can change the material, but you definitely can't change the dimension. Like you can't change the width, height, or length. You can't, for example, if it's a couch, you can't stretch it longer. You can't make it deeper. You can't make it taller. That would be a static family. So meaning it has no parameters. A parameter means an adjustable attribute, something you can change. So a parametric family means a family that you load in, and there's a bunch of what we call parameters. They're attributes that you can change. So they're what I just listed. So if you loaded in a couch and you couldn't change the length, width, height, or depth, or even the material, we'd call that a static family. But if you loaded it in and you can see in your properties menu that you can change the length, height, width, then you know it's a parametric family. Those are parameters. Length, height, width, those are parameters, right? They're attributes that you can adjust. So we'd call that a parametric family. So the point in telling you this is you're going to find your life revolves around families in Revit. And you're going to be frustrated when you're trying to do something. You have a very specific design idea and you can't get the objects that you're loading into your project. If you can't get them to cooperate with you, it's most likely because they're a static family. Not all families that you're going to download from the internet are created equal. It's up to whoever created that family to decide how many parameters that family has. And so you're at the mercy of whoever created the families. And so your goal is to find parametric families to load into your projects, because most likely those will work better for you than just the static ones you'll find. So I'll show you some examples of that. Okay, so let's move on to family hierarchy. So this is going a little bit into the weeds. We're not going to test you on this, but I think you at least need to be familiar with this topic. So we're going to talk about, again, we're talking about loadable families or the component families. Well, actually all families kind of follow this hierarchy, but particularly the loadable. So let's talk about that real quick. So there's the category of family. So that's the highest part of the hierarchy. And the hierarchy matters because in Revit, you've already seen when we go into a view, for example, when you go into the visibility graphics panel, like I showed you before, and you turn off a category of element. So like we turned off the reference planes. That's because that's the category of that family. A reference plane is a family and its category is reference plane, right? We can shut off the floors because their category is floors. So when you're in the visibility graphics panel, you're turning on and off all of the families of that same category. And so it's important to know that there's categories. So what I'm showing you here is there's lots of different categories. There's windows, doors, generic annotations, plumbing fixtures, light fixtures, casework, to name just a few. Floors, walls, all of that. That's a category. Once you're in a category, that's where we talk about families. There's different families in a category. So if we chose the category casework right here, then the families that would fall under that category are things like, okay, there's a hood for over your stove, or there's a base cabinet with a drawer and a door, or there's a sink cabinet or an ADA sink cabinet or a wall cabinet, or a tall cabinet or a wall cabinet, right? An upper cabinet. These all are different families, but they're in the same category. So now let's just pick one of these families. Let's pick the base with a drawer. Now we talk about family types. So this is all going to be the same geometry, right? These all have doors and a drawer, and they're all a base cabinet, but they're different sizes. So this is what we would call different types. So this type would be a 36 by 36 by 24, or this would be 24 by 30 by 30. That would be more for an office. This would be more for a kitchen. And this would be more like a vanity in a bathroom. But the type names are down here. And I'll show you examples of type names when we get into the project. So say we pick the 36 by 36 by 24, and we place it several times in our kitchen. So I'm showing you here an example. We've placed that family 4 times. So each one of these placements inside our specific project, those are called an instance of a family. And there's no specific name for each instance. It's just every time you place it, there's an instance of the family. So again, not real critical. A lot of people that work in Revit don't understand that this is what's happening in the background. But if you understand this, things will make more sense to you as you dive deeper into Revit. Okay, so I also mentioned families can be 2D elements, right? So just annotations. We haven't got into annotations yet, but just keep this in the back of your head because we're going to run into it. There are 2 flavors of annotation families. There's the families that are real world scale, meaning if you draw a brick, so for example, we're looking at a detail here, and there's all these bricks that are detail items. Those are at real world dimensions. So when you change the scale of your view, these items will shrink with the rest of your building, right? They will look like they shrink on the page, or it'll look like they get bigger on the page depending on if you turn the scale up or down, as compared to the paper, because you're trying to change the way the project fits on that sheet of paper. So detail families correspond with your model elements. They'll scale the same way your model scales. What throws people off are what are called annotation families, and they're to paper scale. So they will stay the same size no matter what you change your view scale to. So these are things like room tags, wall tags, electrical symbols. The north arrow is also not scalable. So what that means is if you shrink your scale or shrink your scale or blow it up, it does not matter. These will always stay the same size relative to the paper space. It gets a little confusing, and we'll talk about it more when we go over annotating, but just know that this is also an attribute of families, and it's associated with families. Okay, with all of that said, one of the biggest problems you're going to have is you're going to need families. For example, if you're trying to lay out a living room, you might need a coffee table, you might need a chair, you might need a couch, a love seat. When you're laying out your kitchen, you will need cabinets. And your template that you've been using so far doesn't have all of these families already loaded into it. You've used some families that are loadable, like the doors and windows. Those were preloaded for you in the template, but someone else had to put them in there. By contrast, the walls, the floors, the ceilings, those are always in Revit. They're not loadable families. So where do you get loadable families? So if you go to our course and you go to the home page and you look in our overview page, you'll see, if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see Revit Learning and Content Resources. And under there, there's a category called Families. These are where you can go to download families if you'd like. So one of the oldest places that has existed for the 18 years that I've been using Revit is Revit City. And this is considered kind of a joke in our community. Everyone knows about it. Everyone uses it. Everyone goes to this downloads tab. If you go to the downloads tab, you can search almost anything and find it. Like, let's go with pool table. If you want a pool table, there's going to be options. You need to set up an account. And then once you have an account, it's free. You can download any of these items. But the reason it's a joke is because there's no quality control. The people that create these they throw them up here. Some are good, some are horrible. Actually, I would say I've never really found a good family here, but you'll find families to get your project done. So that's why we all know it and we've all used it, because we use it to get by. So that's one place. And then there's almost anything here. The other places are more specific, like this cabinetry company. You're only going to find cabinets there. And sometimes, like this is a cabinet maker, so they're only going to show cabinets that they manufacture, right? So it may not be as adjustable as you need it to be for your project. But this is where you're going to go. You can also always just type in what you want in a Google browser. You can just say, 12-foot sectional Revit family, and you may get a result that you can use, or you may never find it. So that's the kind of frustrating part. Eventually, it's outside the scope of this class. Eventually, though, if you're going to work in Revit, you should really invest the time to learn how to create loadable families yourself in the Revit Family Creator environment. Like I said, we're only going to barely touch on it just a little. I'm going to teach you just enough that you can edit maybe a title block. And that's probably the extent of it in this course, because it's a whole nother ball of wax. So to help you guys, Slick has also purchased some families for you guys to use. They're really good families. I'm a little biased because I created them. It's one of the companies I own. I create families. But they've purchased a handful of families so that you can have some really good families to work with. And we'll use those in the exercise. And before we use these, I'm going to have to, I'm required to have you sign a disclosure form saying that you can only use these families while you're working on Slick projects. You can't take them out once you graduate or once you move on. You can't use them professionally. You can only use them while you're at Slick. So I'm going to have you sign that. And then once you do that, you'll have access to these families, and then we can start using them for the model. All right. So with that said, that's probably more than you'll ever want to know about families, and it's more than most people know about families who are actually using Revit professionally. But I think it's a base that you should start with. And if you know all this information, you at least can start to understand what's going to happen in the exercise. All right. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next video.